Boom! That's why you're here. The 9850X3D is launching today. It's 7% faster and can use more than 7% more power at times. But the high clock speeds make this a fairly interesting processor. Some games are actually more than 7% faster. Not many. A few, but not many. And boy, it sure is hard to build a computer right now, isn't it? Yes, we can all commiserate about that. But I also want to talk about the 9850X3D. This is the new fastest gaming machine, and this is likely to be ahead of, there's rumors, there's percolation that maybe a competing processor is coming out of Team Blue. We don't have that. There's not even a hint of that. There wasn't even a hint of that at CES, really. But maybe it's coming. But this is dethroning the 9800X3D, and it's coming in at $499. Let's do some benchmarks. Benchmarks in this economy? Are you insane? So this is kind of a refresh, the 9850X3D. Who is this for? This is probably for somebody that is just building a computer. If you have a 9800X3D, you're not going to upgrade. If you have a 7800X3D, this would be a tough, maybe. The high clock speed here is really nice. And that was always kind of the trade-off, right? Is that for certain games or certain workloads, certain non-gaming workloads, the other AM5 CPUs generally would clock higher. This thing clocks much higher. 5.6 gigahertz. It turns out it's 5.6 gigahertz, which is quite a bit faster. About 7% faster than the 9800X3D. So 7% faster, that should translate, right? It's also weird because Intel hasn't announced a new desktop CPU. CES was rife with lots of Panther Lake news, but really the only thing I have to compare to is the Core Ultra 9 285K. And the really surprising thing is that Cinebench is about the same speed on this new processor. These are 8-core processors, 16 threads, and the Core Ultra 9 is 8 performance cores, and then you got 16 efficiency cores. And Cinebench is as fast on 8 cores, and even before we get to the gaming? What? How is this possible? V-Ray is not quite as fast, but Cinebench is basically the same speed on this processor as a Core Ultra 9 285K. For gaming performance, especially if you got a high-end GPU like a 5090, we already knew the 9800 X3D was the fastest CPU, right? Well, it's even faster. I'm upgrading my Falcon Northwest Tiki to be a 9850 X3D. And that's where I discovered something interesting. Cooling does actually make a little bit of a difference. This is a 120 watt TDP CPU. The 9800 X3D is a 120 watt TDP CPU. But if you have better cooling, this processor will reward you, especially in the 1% lows. So like Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be about 7% faster than a 9800 X3D, or significantly faster than a Core Ultra 9. Those are kind of outliers. Star Wars, depending on what area of the game that you're playing, Star Wars Outlaws, can be up to 7%. On average, it was 4 to 5, just depending on what game area that you're playing in. So, yes, like I say, it's not an upgrade that makes sense for people that are already on something amazing. But if you bought an inexpensive AM5 CPU, like a 7600, and you were holding out to upgrade, now might be the time that you want to upgrade before things get even more bleak over the next couple of years, probably. And this CPU does offer a really interesting option. And it was fun because AMD even called this out on their slides. It's with all that Vcache, you can use slower memory. Is that a challenge? Oh my gosh, look at that. It's Dell OEM Crucial. RIP Crucial. 5600. Ancient DDR5. Does it work fine at 5600? Yeah, it only hurts your gameplay performance. Generally, about 2% at worst. So 100 FPS and Cyberpunk becomes 98 FPS. I think you'll live. The other interesting thing was, what about 1DIMM? 1DIMM is a little worse. You could limp by on 1DIMM. I wouldn't really recommend it, but maybe that's an option. That may be an option for other manufacturers to ramp up. DDR5 has been a challenge at these blistering speeds, like beyond 5600. And you remember CU DIMM? We had CU DIMM on the Intel platform. It's like, oh, we'll have 8800. And then like 4 DIMMs on the platform is also still a little bit tricky. 4 DIMMs is a little more possible on the MSI platform. But who was crazy enough to buy 256 gigs of memory for AM5? As we did in a video before the madness. So could you limp by on a single 8 gig stick? If you've got 3D Vcache, you're certainly going to have a much better experience with Vcache than without. But that's kind of bleak, isn't it? Isn't that like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not to the point where it's like, no, I'm not going to buy a computer. But it might be to the point where you're going to corporate surplus auctions and harvesting desktop computers for their DDR5 memory, because what else are you going to do? It's really an unfortunate time that AMD is launching the 9850X3D in a great RAM drought. It's certainly easy to not be enthusiastic about building a machine, and at the same time, it's like the CPU is insanely fast. I wish that they had launched with these kinds of CPU speeds. Like, what was holding them back? Because this is binning. Is this a TSMC thing? Did they really just dial it in? Because again, the 5.6 gigahertz clock speed in Windows and Linux generally is across the board. Like, it holds up really well. The power usage is a little higher with this CPU than not, but does anybody on a desktop computer really care about power utilization? I mean, I know it's 120 watts TDP versus 120 watts TDP, but this CPU definitely benefits from better cooling and will reward you if you give it a little bit better cooling, even before you turn on PBO or anything like that. So it's really nice to see, actually. All right, so for our test system configuration, we're using the ROG Crosshair Hero X870E from Asus. This is a full AMD recommended BIOS defaults, not the Asus defaults, but with the Expo profile set on our G.Skill Trident Z memory. This is F5 6000J28, so this is CL28 memory. It's very fast. It's the TZ5NR kit of memory, and this is 32 gigabytes, two 16 gig sticks. So it's very fancy in this configuration. For storage, we're using a Samsung 9100 Pro 1 terabyte game drive. It's a pretty zippy drive. It can do 15 gigabytes per second. And for our RAM, our secondary RAM, for slow testing, it's like, will it work with slow, crappy memory? We're using Dell OEM Crucial DDR5 5600. Yeah, 1 and 2 sticks. For cooling, we tried the ND15 tower cooler, as well as the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2. It's a little older. Our Liquid Freezer 2 is perfectly fine. It's perfectly serviceable cooling. It's a very good liquid cooler. And an AIO for this CPU definitely is awesome. I did okay with the Noctua. Runs a little hot, but the Noctua in a dual fan configuration, not bad for D15. All right, look, it's 7% faster. What do you want for the benchmarks? Let's look at Borderlands 4, 9850X3D, 9800X3D. It's 1 FPS faster at 1440p. Okay, it pulls a little ahead, 2 FPS, 2160p. It's the same performance. This speaks more to Borderlands than it does anything. What about an older game like Deus Ex Mankind Divided? Ooh, that's a nice little bit of an uplift, and a nice little bit of an uplift on our 1% lows. And the 1% lows story, I think, is the more interesting story on this CPU. So even at 2160p, we have a little bit better 1% low performance, even though our top line average frame rate really isn't a lot different between these two CPUs. 1440p, okay, the average is a fair bit different. 1080p, okay, it kind of makes sense. Monster Hunter Wilds, 139 versus 138. 9850X3D, our 1% lows, that's doing pretty good. 1440p, 89. 2160p, 68. Even at 4K, we get a little bit of a performance bump, which is nice to see. An ancient game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, functionally no difference in performance at 1080p. 1440p, okay, the 9850X3D is more than margin of error faster, just barely. And then at 4K, things sort of equalize again. So 1440p is the interesting outlier. 1080p, the engine can't handle it. 1440p, there you go. And 2160p, oh, the boiler snake. Got a little bit of water hammer in my century-old steam heating system. It's fine. It's fine. It's gonna get a little louder here in a minute. Okay, let's throw in the 9950X3D. So the 9850X3D, that's your gaming CPU, right? It's the high clock speed. Wouldn't it be awesome to have a 9850X3D that has a high clock speed? See, the 9950X3D is interesting because there's the high clock speed chiplet, And then there's the slower chiplet that has Vcache. And so depending on the scheduler in your operating system can choose to put your game on the Vcache chiplet if your game needs that, or if your game doesn't really benefit from Vcache, you can put it on the fast one. And Windows almost always does the wrong thing. Borderlands 4, really not a huge difference here. If we expand our graph, it's like, oh, let's talk about the performance here at 9800X3D, 9850X3D. Yeah, so the boiler snake is just like, what's going on? And what's going on with our frame rate here? Like, at 9950X3D on top with 115 FPS, but the 9850X3D is 118. It's sort of Z to A, so well, it'll be fun. Deus Ex Mankind Divided, 9950X3D. Deus Ex chooses the wrong chiplet every time. This is a scheduling thing. This is also fine with game mode run in Linux. So if you're running Linux, you don't have this problem, and this is one of the scenarios where Linux performance is better than Windows, and it depends on the CPU, depends on a lot of things, and on the 9950X3D, because Deus Ex Mankind Divided is an ancient game, but it also the 1% lows. Like, check that out. 137 versus 180 on our 9850X3D. So, it's sort of what I'm talking about. Monster Hunter Wilds, 9950X3D with 131 versus 139, and again, our 1% lows. Very nice to see. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Again, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is an older, ancient title. It chooses the wrong thing. This is why it's important to have the AMD chipset drivers installed. The AMD chipset drivers will, to an extent, mitigate some of this kind of problem, depending on what's running in the background and some other parameters for your system. You can generally count on the AMD chipset drivers to do a good job, and your performance can be better than this. But with our stuff that's running in the background and some of our specific setup stuff, I sort of rigged the 9950 here to show you, like, you don't have to do much wrong accidentally or on purpose in our case in order to have, like, you have to go through some extra steps sometimes to get better performance on a 9950X3D. And this is why, some of there are folks out there that are like Intel sycophants that are doing some of these benchmarks, and I see some of these results and it's like, ooh, no, sweetie, but it's a fair point that you as person driving the computer shouldn't have to think about these things and worry about it. And with the 9850X3D, you sure don't. 382 FPS, that is very, very nice. And also if you're on Linux, you generally don't have to think about this because game mode run. COD Blop 7. 950X3D, 244 FPS, 9850X3D, 257 frames per second. But the 1% lows, again, the story here is the 1% low improvement. Clair Obscur, 1% low improvements. 1080p, 1440p, okay, it's basically the same. 4K. I almost forgot that on COD Blops, but again, the 1% lows, even at 1440p on COD Blops 7, that is a pretty substantial improvement. 4K, a little bit of an improvement, a little bit of an overall frame rate improvement. I like testing in Cyberpunk because it's kind of a known quantity. Cyberpunk, 1080p, 241 FPS versus 208. This is a substantial uplift for this gaming CPU. 1440p shows a similar uplift, especially in 1%. 4K, things are basically equal performance. 119 FPS versus 117 FPS, nothing to sneeze at. But notice the performance does pull very slightly ahead. This is almost, but not quite, within margin of error. Final Fantasy runs really well, 381 FPS at 1080p, 1440p, 332 FPS, and at 4K, 208 FPS. And our 1% lows, pretty consistently better on the 9850X3D. The Callisto Protocol, an older title, not a lot of folks are playing this, but visually very interesting. 297 FPS on our 9850X3D. This engine might be one of the ones that benefits from a higher clock speed as opposed to Vcache, at least in this scenario. At 1440p, it's, again, the 9850X3D pulls well ahead. Even at 4K, 287 FPS, and our 1% lows are improved here. What about the remastered Elder Scrolls? Well, between the 9950X3D and the 9850X3D, it's a very similar performance. At 1440p, the 9850X3D is just barely more than margin of error faster, and at 4K, it's almost margin of error when we're talking about average frame rate, but that 1% low experience, again, is pretty good. if ray tracing is something interesting, and ray tracing certainly is something interesting on the remastered Elder Scrolls game, 9850X3D, you're getting 8 more FPS and a little bit better 1% low experience at 1080p. 1440p and at 4K you can barely manage 60 FPS. There's really not a lot of difference between the 9950X3D and the 9850X3D, but at 1440p you get a little bit better 1% low experience. So yeah, the higher clock speeds plus Vcache, definitely very nice for gaming. Just for the sake of completeness, we've got Geekbench 6 CPU. We've got our 9950X3D, 9850X3D, and our 9800X3D. You can see some minor differences in single thread, and of course multi-thread is going to be much better on the 16-core part. OpenCL, this one is maybe a little surprising because OpenCL is somehow faster on the 9800X3D than the 9850. This was repeatable, but I don't know. Vulkan, however, 9850X3D is fastest for Vulkan operations. No surprises there. So, now what about slow RAM? We talked about slow RAM. Yes, we have slow RAM. Borderlands 4, there is functionally no difference if you put 5600 RAM in your system. 1440p, it's a hair slower. 4K, it is a hair slower. This is almost, but not quite, margin of error. So if you want to run slow memory with your 9850X3D, this is the level of penalty that you're going to endure, i.e. not much. Deus Ex Mankind Divided, it's an older title, 5600 memory. Again, it's almost, but not quite, margin of error. 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. 5600 is basically fine. Monster Hunter Wilds, 5600 memory is basically fine. It is a little slower. The 1% lows took a little bit more of a hit here than I expected, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. And that was true whether it was 1080p, 1440p, or even 4K. Well, like 2 FPS of 4K, so not too bad, really. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with 5600 memory at 1080p. Its 1% lows are a little worse, but not really. 1440p, 1% lows again. I mean, this is so close for the average frame rate, but the 1% lows are where you're going to suffer. There's going to be a little bit more of just a tiny bit more of a stutter. But if you're saving hundreds of dollars off the cost of your machine, then you don't necessarily have to get gamer memory. This is, again, potato class, like what ships with Dell OEM systems of 5600. So not only is it 5600, that cast latency is like 42 or something absurd like that. And of course, the worse your memory is, like if you go for 4800, it will be a little bit less on the 1% lows. I think in the 1% low experience will be a little bit worse. But having that much cache with most modern titles is not going to negatively impact you that much. So if you're going to save hundreds of dollars of cost off the cost of the machine because you're using older memory or slower memory, that seems like a no-brainer. And the MSRP, if you didn't hear it at the beginning, was $499. So that's also nice to see. AMD is on top. They are the gaming champions, and it's probably, their margins are probably worse on $499 than not $499 than it was a long time ago. And so that was very kind of them to do that. None of these companies are your friends, but that is still kind of a PR win. And it also puts a lot of competitive pressure, I think, on Intel to, because Intel's got to be working on their next thing, right? It's like, is there a gaming Panther Lake thing coming? No, probably not. Is there going to be like some sort of refresh of, the Core Ultra 9? I don't know, maybe. But for this, out the gate, yeah, it's a win for AMD. It's a win across the board. It's a win for engineering. It's a win even if you're running on a potato class motherboard with a single stick of memory. And that's where we are in 2026. Is it going to get better or worse? I don't know. Hello, commenters from the future. Tell us, engage below. Did 2026 get better or worse? I don't know. All right, I'm Wildless Level 1. I'm signing out. If you have any questions or I missed anything, you want me to test your game, let me know. I'm signing out and I'll see you in the forums. I'm signing out and I'll see you there.